Silas, the old sawmill worker, sighed. He looked down at his hands, thick with the grease and grime of years spent fixing machines and hauling logs. He rubbed his thumb over a dark smudge near his knuckle. It wasn't just grease, though. It was a memory, as clear as the scent of sawdust that always clung to him. He remembered another kind of smudge a long, long time ago. That smudge was black ink from one of posters. He'd torn them down one by one, feeling the rough paper tear under his fingers. Each rip was a beat of his heart, thumping hard in his chest. The ink had smeared across his palms, leaving dark streaks that wouldn't wash off right away. Those posters had a picture of Jed, his friend, smiling a little too wide, like he'd just gotten away with something. Jed had done wrong, really wrong, but Silas had believed in him, had seen the good heart buried deep inside. He had to give Jed a chance, even if it meant breaking a few rules himself. He could almost feel the dusty air of the old town square, the nervous glance over his shoulder as he'd pulled the last poster down. It was a secret he'd kept buried deep, like a forgotten nail in a dusty board. Now, looking at his hands, the grease felt like a heavier, more honest kind of dirt. The deep, hungry whine of the sawmill's blades sliced through Silas's thoughts, pulling him from the past. It was a sound he knew better than his own breath, a song of wood being shaped and changed. The sound made him think of another day, years ago, when the mill had been quieter, yet his heart had thumped louder than any machinery. He remembered Jed bursting into the mill, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. Jed's words had tumbled out like loose rocks, telling of a bad mistake, a moment of weakness that had put him in deep trouble. Silas had felt a cold shiver, a pang of fear for his friend. He could have turned Jed away, could have told him to face what he'd done alone. But then, Silas looked at Jed's shaking hands, at the raw fear in his eyes. He saw the boy he'd known since they were knee-high, the one who'd always shared his last biscuit. A stronger feeling, a pull deep inside, had pushed away the fear. It was loyalty, thick and stubborn as the oldest oak. Jed was his friend. That meant something. That meant everything. The saw whined again, a long, drawn-out note that seemed to echo the quiet promise Silas had made to himself that day. He would help Jed, no matter what. He would face the whispers and the danger, just like he faced the sharp teeth of the saw every day. The familiar scent of fresh-cut pine filled Silas's lungs, a comfort he'd known his whole life. But that day, years ago, the pine smell had been mixed with something else, the sour taste of fear. He remembered the heavy, sweet smell of the wood in the mill, where he'd tried to calm his pounding heart before heading into town. His hands had trembled as he thought about what he was about to do. He'd waited until dusk, when shadows stretched long and thin across the dusty street. The town's notice board, usually bustling with folks reading news, was empty. Still, every creak of the boardwalk, every distant dog bark, made him jump. He moved like a ghost, his eyes darting from side to side. He could almost feel eyes on him, even though he knew he was alone. He pulled the first poster, feeling the dry paper tear. He crumpled it quickly, stuffing it into his coat. Then another and another. Each one was a risk, a secret act. He imagined someone stepping out of a doorway, calling his name, catching him red-handed. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of pine, which usually made him feel safe, now just reminded him of the quiet, watchful woods surrounding the town, hiding all its secrets. He just wanted to get it done, to make Jed a little safer, and then disappear back into the honest smell of the sawmill. Silas shook his head, pushing the old fears back into their dusty corners. The present called, and it was a loud, rumbling call. A fancy stagecoach, painted a dark, shiny black, rolled into town. It wasn't the usual dusty carriage that brought supplies or hopeful settlers. This one looked too heavy, too serious. Its wheels crunched on the gravel, making a sound that seemed to chew up the quiet afternoon. 4 men stepped out, dressed in suits that looked too fine for the dusty streets of Harmony Gulch. Their faces were sharp, like hungry birds. One had a thin mustache and eyes that darted around, sizing everything up. Another carried a leather bag that looked important. Silas had seen men like them before, though not often in his little town. They were from the big city banks, the kind that didn't care about a man's hard work or bad luck. He knew, deep in his bones, why they were here. They weren't here to admire the sawmill or the clean air. They were here to take homes, to take shops, to take whatever they could from folks who owed money and couldn't pay it back. He'd heard stories from other towns where men like these had swept through, leaving behind only empty houses and broken dreams. A chill colder than any winter wind ran down Silas's spine. He watched them walk towards a bank building, their steps firm and unwelcoming. The shadow they cast over the town felt darker than any cloud. The sight of the bank men filled Silas with a cold dread, but it also sparked another memory, softer than the others, yet just as clear. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against a tiny, brittle piece of wood. It was a burned matchstick, kept safe for decades. He pulled it out, turning it over in his calloused fingers. He remembered the night he and Jed sat by a small, sputtering campfire outside town. Jed was down, really down after his troubles, after Silas had torn down those posters. The night was dark and silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Silas had pulled out a match, struck it on his boot, and watched the tiny flame flicker to life. In its brief glow, he saw Jed's face, worn and tired, but with a hint of hope. Jed, Silas had said, his voice quiet but firm, "I ain't gonna leave you. Not ever. I'll always be there, through thick and thin." The match burned down, getting hotter on his fingertips, but he held it until the flame died, leaving only a wisp of smoke and a glowing ember. Jed had looked at him, his eyes shining in the dying light, and nodded slowly. It wasn't a loud promise, but it was as real as the heat from the tiny flame. That burned match was a sign of a promise kept, a friendship that wouldn't break. And looking at the dark stagecoach now, Silas knew that promise might need to be remembered once more. Suddenly, a loud clang echoed through the quiet street, making Silas jump. It was the familiar, ringing sound of the blacksmith's anvil. Clang. It meant Old Man Hemlock was at work, shaping hot metal. But for Silas, that sound carried another memory, one tied to Jed's changed life. After his troubles, after Silas had given him that second chance, Jed had worked hard to make things right. He hadn't run away. Instead, he'd found work with Man Hemlock, learning the trade of a blacksmith. Silas remembered visiting the smithy, the air thick with smoke and the smell of hot iron. He'd seen Jed, sweat dripping from his brow, swinging a hammer with a newfound purpose. Asterisk clang, clang. Asterisk each strike was a sign of effort, of a man trying to build something honest with his own hands. Jed wasn't the same wild boy who'd gotten into trouble. The fire in his eyes was different now. Not the spark of mischief, but the steady glow of determination. He'd put his past behind him, forging a new path. Silas had watched him, proud of the change, proud that his loyalty hadn't been misplaced. The anvil's ringing sound was a testament to Jed's hard work, a reminder that people could change, could become better. And if Jed had changed, then maybe this town, caught in the shadow of these bank men, could also find a way to stand firm, just like hot iron being hammered into something strong. Silas started walking, his old boots thudding softly on the dusty path before stepping onto the town's wooden boardwalk. The boards groaned and creaked under his weight, a familiar song of aged timber. Each creak was like a tired sigh from the town itself, a town that had seen many seasons, many joys, and many sorrows. But today, the creaks felt different, heavier, as if the boardwalk shared his worry. He watched the bankmen. Their shiny shoes made sharp, important clicks as they strode across the boardwalk, their steps firm and quick. They didn't seem to notice the old wood sighing beneath them. They were all business, their faces set like stone. They marched right up to the bank door, pushed it open without a knock, and disappeared inside. The door swung shut behind them with a solid thud, sealing away the last bits of sunlight. A tight knot twisted in Silas's stomach. It was the same feeling he got when a big log jammed in the mill, threatening to stop everything. These men were a jam, a blockage in the smooth flow of Harmony Gulch. He thought of all the families, the farmers, the shopkeepers who might have borrowed money from that bank. He imagined their worried faces, their homes suddenly at risk. The creaking of the boardwalk seemed to whisper their fears, a quiet chorus of uncertainty. Silas knew he couldn't just stand there and listen to the town's silent plea. He had to do something. Silas leaned against a hitching post, his eyes fixed on the closed bank door. A small crowd had begun to gather, faces etched with curiosity and concern. Most were just townspeople, whispering amongst themselves. Then, his gaze fell upon a man standing a little apart from the rest, his shoulders broad, his hands calloused. It was Jed. Older, for sure, with more lines around his eyes and mouth, lines that told stories of hard work and quiet thought. His hair was streaked with gray at the temples, but the familiar spark was still in his eyes. He wasn't the scared, wild young man Silas had known. This was a man forged by life, much like the iron he now shaped. Jed hadn't seen Silas at first, his attention also fixed on the bank. But then, as if feeling Silas's gaze, he turned his head slowly. Their eyes met across the dusty street. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jed's lips curved into a small, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past, of the promise given, and of the unspoken understanding that had always bound them. It wasn't a showy gesture, but it warmed Silas's heart like a crackling fire. Jed was here, and Silas knew, without a single word, that he wasn't alone in his worry for the town. The bank doors swung open again, revealing the dark, gaping mouth of the vault. It stood open like a hungry beast, showing off its empty insides. There were no stacks of gold, no piles of money, just cold, hard emptiness. The bank men, their voices sharp and loud, stood by the vault, pointing and talking. Their words carried across the street, clear and cruel. "Everything must go," one of them barked, his voice echoing a little. "This property, the surrounding land, all assets." He waved a paper, crisp and official-looking. "We'll sell it all off to cover the debts." A hush fell over the small crowd. The townsfolk looked at each other, their faces filled with worry and sadness. Old Mrs. Gable wrung her hands, her eyes fixed on the bank. Her little bakery, the one that smelled so sweet every morning, might be next. Young Tom, who had just bought his first plot of land to farm, looked pale. Their dreams, their futures, were being talked about as if they were just numbers on a page. Silas watched, his stomach twisting even tighter. The empty vault seemed to swallow the hope right out of the air. It was a cold, hard truth laid bare. These men meant business, and their business was taking everything. He glanced at Jed, whose face was now grim, his jaw tight. The quiet understanding between them deepened. It wasn't just Jed's past anymore. It was the town's future, hanging by a thread, about to be pulled by the greedy hands of these strangers. Just as the bank men seemed ready to push past the silent, worried townsfolk, a rumble started. It wasn't the sound of the stagecoach, nor the anvil. It was a murmur that grew into something solid. Suddenly, a group of men stepped forward, moving as one, placing themselves directly in front of the bankmen. Their faces were grim, their stances firm. They weren't armed, but their presence was like a wall. Silas blinked, then squinted. He recognized them. There was Caleb, who'd lost his farm in a bad flood and had nowhere to go until Jed gave him work. There was Thomas, who'd arrived in town with nothing but the clothes on his back, Jed offering him a place in the smithy. And little Jimmy, who Jed had taught to read and write in the evenings. These were the men Jed had helped, one by one, after his own troubles. Men who had been down on their luck, and Jed had given them a hand up, a job, a chance to get back on their feet. The bank men looked surprised, their sharp faces twitching with annoyance. They hadn't expected this. They expected meekness, fear, easy targets. But these men stood tall, blocking the path, their eyes steady. It was a silent challenge, a line drawn in the dust. Silas felt a surge of warmth, pushing back the cold dread. Jed's good deeds, sown quietly over the years, were now bearing fruit, standing firm against the bank's harsh demands. The bank men huffed and puffed, trying to push past the solid wall of townsfolk, But the men Jed had helped stood firm. Their eyes, once filled with despair, now shone with quiet strength. And then Jed himself stepped forward, moving with purpose to stand shoulder to shoulder with Caleb, Thomas, and Jimmy. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was a leader standing up for his town. Jed looked across the street, his gaze finding Silas. There was no need for words. In his eyes, Silas saw a deep well of thanks. Thanks for the second chance, for the belief when no one else would give it, for the loyalty that had pulled him from the brink. It was a silent conversation between old friends, a powerful moment. The men Jed had helped were now helping him, and by extension, helping the entire town. It was a circle, a quiet testament to the power of kindness and second chances. Jed had extended a hand to those who were down, and now, when the town itself was down, those hands had come together to form a shield. The bank men, used to dealing with individuals, seemed confused by this united front. They mumbled among themselves, their faces growing red. The air, thick with tension moments before, now hummed with a different kind of energy, one of quiet resolve. It was the loyalty Jed had learned from Silas, now spread like wildfire through the community. The bank men, who had looked so sure of themselves just moments before, now shifted their weight, their faces losing their hard edges. They glanced at the silent, determined faces of the townsfolk, then at each other. They had expected easy pickings, a town too scared to stand up for itself. But this wasn't what they found. This was a wall, built not of brick and mortar, but of shared loyalty and quiet strength. The man with the thin mustache cleared his throat, his voice less sharp than before. He mumbled something about unexpected resistance and re-evaluating their approach. It was clear they knew they couldn't just walk in and take everything. This wasn't a town that would roll over and play dead. With a final huff and a grumble, the bank men turned. They walked back to their fancy stagecoach, their important steps now sounding more like a retreat. The wheels crunched on the gravel as they turned around, heading back the way they came. The dark, shiny carriage disappeared down the road, leaving behind a silence that was slowly filled with a soft murmur of relief. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the crowd. Then a few quiet cheers started, growing a little louder, but still respectful, like they didn't want to break the spell of their quiet victory. Folks smiled at each other, their faces brighter than they had been all day. It wasn't a loud, booming triumph, but a gentle, steady win, like the quiet flow of a river after a long drought. Silas watched the stagecoach disappear, a quiet smile spreading across his face. He looked down at his hands again. They were still stained with grease, dark and ingrained from years of working the sawmill. But now, the grease didn't feel like a mark of hard labor or hidden secrets. It felt like something good. He remembered the ink from the wanted posters, a different kind of stain, one that had felt like guilt and worry. But that ink had faded, washed away by time and by Jed's own hard work to make things right. The burned matchstick in his pocket, the sound of the anvil, the creak of the boardwalk, all these memories now felt different. They weren't just reminders of fear or hard times. They were parts of a bigger story, a story of loyalty, of second chances, and of people helping each other. His hands, rough and calloused, were a testament to a life lived honestly, a life where he'd stood by a friend. And that friend, in turn, had built a life that helped others, creating a chain of kindness that had protected their town today. The old memories, once tinged with worry, now shone with a quiet happiness. Silas knew, deep in his heart, that this grease, this honest dirt, was the mark of a good life, a life well lived. He turned and walked towards the sawmill, the familiar whine of the blade, now sounding like a song of peace.